The sun touches the horizon one last time, and then it simply stops rising. There is no sudden plunge into blackness, no switch flipped, just a slow and quiet withdrawal of light from the sky. In the northernmost parts of Alaska, above the Arctic Circle, the sun dips below the edge of the world in late November and does not return for more than 60 days. The Earth keeps turning. The clocks keep ticking. But the sun stays hidden below the curve of the planet. And the people who live there must find ways to move through a world wrapped in twilight and night. This is the polar night, a season of darkness so complete and so long that it reshapes everything about how humans and animals survive in one of the most remote places on Earth. Hello there, and welcome to Info Jungle, where curiosity slows down and the world feels a little quieter. Tonight, we're heading somewhere few people imagine clearly. We're going to the top of Alaska, to places like Barrow, now called Utqiagvik, and to the scattered villages and research stations that sit perched on the frozen edge of the Arctic Ocean. We're going to watch the sun disappear, and then stay with the people and the land through the long darkness that follows. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you? If these quiet journeys help you rest, feel free to like or subscribe. But only if you want more calm science to drift into. The polar night is not a myth or an exaggeration. It is a real phenomenon that happens every year in the high Arctic, driven by the tilt of the Earth and the geometry of its orbit around the sun. For people who have only ever lived in places where the sun rises and sets every single day, the idea of months without daylight can feel impossible to understand. But for the people who call the Arctic home, the polar night is simply a season, like winter or summer anywhere else. It has its own rhythms and its own beauty. It has its challenges too, but it is not something to be feared. It is something to be lived through, quietly and carefully, with patience and preparation. And when the sun finally does return, after weeks of waiting, the light feels different. It feels earned. Something deeper waits beneath this cycle. The days grow shorter in Alaska, just like they do everywhere else, as autumn moves into winter. But in the far north, above the Arctic Circle, the shortening happens faster and more dramatically. By October, the sun barely clears the horizon at midday. By early November, it skims along the southern edge of the sky for just a few hours before dipping back down. The light becomes slanted and weak, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. The snow begins to accumulate. The ice thickens on the ocean. And then, sometime in late November, depending on exactly how far north you are, the sun rises one last time, traces a low arc across the southern horizon, and then sets for the final time until the new year. In Utqiagvik, the northernmost town in the United States, the last sunset happens around November 21st or 22nd. The exact date shifts slightly from year to year. Atmospheric conditions play a role. The refraction of light through the cold air affects the timing. But the pattern is always the same. The sun appears briefly in the south, glowing pale and orange through the haze. Then it sinks below the horizon. It does not return. There is no ceremony, no alarm sounds. Life simply continues, but now without the sun. The people who live there have been preparing for this moment for weeks. They know it is coming. They have seen it before. But even so, there is a strange weight to that final sunset. A quiet acknowledgement that the light is leaving and will not be back for a long time. The moment itself is not dramatic. The sun does not vanish in an instant. It fades slowly, the way it does at the end of any day. The sky turns from blue to purple to deep indigo. The stars begin to appear. The temperature drops, and then the twilight lingers for hours. It is stretched out by the angle of the earth. The atmosphere bends the last traces of sunlight around the curve of the planet. This twilight is called civil twilight. It provides just enough light to see by for a little while longer. But gradually, over the next few days, even that fades. The sky darkens further. The hours of dim light shrink. And eventually, the polar night settles in fully. The world above the Arctic Circle enters a season of near-total darkness that will last for more than 2 months. For the people who live through this, the last sunset is a threshold. It marks the beginning of a different kind of time. Time is measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the subtle shifts in the quality of the darkness itself. The polar night is not uniform. It has its own variations, its own gradations of light and shadow. There are days when the sky glows faintly in the south around midday. It is a reminder that the sun is still there, just below the horizon. There are nights when the moon hangs full and bright. It casts enough light to see the landscape clearly. And there are nights when the auroras dance overhead. They fill the sky with green and purple curtains of light. The curtains ripple and shift in silence. The darkness is not empty. It is full of things to see, if you know how to look. But still, the absence of the sun is felt. It changes the rhythm of daily life. It changes the way people sleep and wake. It changes the way they think about time itself. Without the sun to mark the hours, the days can blur together. Morning and evening lose their usual meaning. The clock on the wall becomes the only reliable guide. And yet people adapt. They always have. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic have lived through the polar night for thousands of years. They have developed ways of navigating the darkness, ways of staying warm, ways of finding food, ways of maintaining their sense of place and purpose even when the sun is gone. And the modern residents of towns like Utqiagvik carry on that tradition. They blend ancient knowledge with modern technology. They create lives that are rich and full, even in the heart of the longest night. What happens next is tied to something far larger than Alaska itself. The reason the sun disappears in the Arctic for months has nothing to do with Alaska itself. It has everything to do with the shape and motion of the Earth. The planet we live on is a sphere, or very nearly one. It spins on an axis that runs through the North and South poles. But that axis is not straight up and down relative to the plane of Earth's orbit around the sun. It is tilted at an angle of about 23.5 degrees. This tilt is what gives us seasons. As the Earth moves around the sun over the course of a year, different parts of the planet are angled toward the sun or away from it. When the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun, it is summer in the north and winter in the south. When the northern hemisphere is tilted away, it is winter in the north and summer in the south. But the tilt does more than just create warm and cold seasons. It also determines how long the sun stays above the horizon each day at different latitudes. Near the equator, the sun rises and sets at roughly the same time every day all year long. This is because the equator is always more or less perpendicular to the sun's rays. But as you move north or south away from the equator, the length of the day begins to change with the seasons. In summer, the days get longer the farther north you go. In winter, they get shorter. And if you go far enough north, beyond the Arctic Circle, at about 66.5 degrees north latitude, something remarkable happens. In the summer, the sun stops setting at all. It circles around the sky. It dips close to the horizon, but never quite disappears. This is called the midnight sun. And in the winter, the opposite occurs. The sun stops rising. It stays below the horizon for days or weeks or even months, depending on how far north you are. This is the polar night. The Arctic Circle marks the line where this phenomenon begins. On the day of the winter solstice, around December 21st, the sun does not rise at all at the Arctic Circle. It stays just below the horizon all day. But if you are standing exactly on the Arctic Circle, you will still see some twilight around midday. A faint glow in the southern sky. If you move farther north, the polar night lasts longer. At Utqiagvik, which is more than 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle, the sun stays below the horizon for about 65 days. At the North Pole itself, the polar night lasts for nearly 6 months, from late September to late March. The farther north you go, the longer the darkness. This is not a malfunction of the solar system. It is not a sign that something is wrong with the Earth. It is simply geometry. The Earth is tilted. As it orbits the sun, that tilt causes different parts of the planet to experience different amounts of daylight. For half the year, the North Pole is tilted away from the sun. The Arctic is plunged into darkness. For the other half of the year, the North Pole is tilted toward the sun. The Arctic basks in continuous daylight. The transition between these two extremes happens gradually, over weeks and months. The sun does not suddenly appear or disappear. It slowly creeps higher or lower in the sky, day by day. Eventually, it crosses the threshold of the horizon. It stays on one side for an extended period. Understanding this helps to take away some of the strangeness of the polar night. It is not magic. It is not a curse. It is just the natural result of living on a tilted planet that orbits a star. And once you understand the mechanics, you can begin to appreciate the beauty of it. The polar night is a window into the deeper patterns of the solar system. It is a reminder that the Earth is not fixed and unchanging. It is constantly moving through space in ways that shape the rhythms of life on its surface. The people who live in the Arctic are witnesses to this motion in a way that people in lower latitudes are not. They see the consequences of the tilt written across the sky every single day. But something else shapes the experience of this darkness. Something quieter and more gradual. We'll return to that soon. Because the way people experience the polar night depends not just on the absence of the sun, but on the presence of other kinds of light. But first, it helps to understand that the darkness is not absolute. There's something deeper to explore about the way twilight lingers, and the way the sky never goes completely black, even in the heart of winter. When the sun sets for the last time in late November, the Arctic does not immediately plunge into total blackness. Instead, there is a long period of twilight that stretches across the weeks that follow. Twilight is the light that remains in the sky after the sun has gone below the horizon. It is caused by the scattering of sunlight through the upper layers of the atmosphere. Even though the sun itself is out of sight, its light still reaches the air high above the observer. Some of that light scatters down to the ground, The result is a soft, diffuse glow that can last for hours, depending on how far the sun is below the horizon. There are three types of twilight. They are defined by the angle of the sun below the horizon. Civil twilight occurs when the sun is less than 6 degrees below the horizon. During civil twilight, there is enough light to see clearly without artificial illumination. You can read a book outside if you are patient. You can walk without a flashlight. The sky is bright enough that the brightest stars are just beginning to appear. Nautical twilight occurs when the sun is between 6 and 12 degrees below the horizon. The light is dimmer now. The horizon is still visible over the ocean, which is why sailors use this time to navigate by the stars. And astronomical twilight occurs when the sun is between 12 and 18 degrees below the horizon. During astronomical twilight, the sky is dark enough to see faint stars and galaxies. But there is still a faint glow along the horizon where the sun lingers just out of sight. In the early days of the polar night, the Arctic experiences several hours of civil twilight each day, centered around noon. The sky glows faintly in the south, a pale band of light that never quite turns into daylight. But it provides enough illumination to see the landscape. The snow reflects this dim light, brightening the world just a little. The horizon is a gradient of colors, deep blue fading into orange, and pink where the sun hides. This is not the dramatic twilight of lower latitudes, where the sky blazes with color for a few minutes and then goes dark. This is a slow, gentle twilight that lingers for hours, as if the sun is reluctant to fully let go. As the days pass and the winter solstice approaches, the sun sinks deeper below the horizon. The period of civil twilight shrinks. By late December, in places like Utqiagvik, the midday sky is only bright enough for nautical twilight. The world is darker now, but not completely dark. There is still a faint glow in the south around noon, a reminder that the sun is still there, circling just below the edge of the world. The stars are visible all day now, except for a few hours in the middle of the day when the sky is too bright for them. The moon, if it is up, becomes the dominant source of light. And if the moon is full, the landscape is bathed in a cold, silvery glow. It makes the snow sparkle. It makes the ice shine. After the winter solstice, the sun begins to climb back toward the horizon. Slowly and imperceptibly at first, the twilight begins to lengthen again. By mid-January, the midday sky is once again bright enough for civil twilight. By late January, the glow in the south is unmistakable, a clear sign that the sun is coming back. And in the third week of January, usually around the 20th or 21st, the sun finally peaks above the horizon for the first time in more than 2 months. The first sunrise is brief, just a few minutes of the sun's upper edge visible above the southern horizon before it dips back down. But it is enough. It is a promise that the light is returning, that the long darkness is ending, that the world will soon be bright again. But during the weeks when the twilight is at its faintest, when the sun is at its lowest point below the horizon, the darkness is profound. It is not the darkness of a moonless night in a city where streetlights and buildings glow. It is not the darkness of a country night where the stars provide a little light. It is the darkness of a place where the sun has been gone for weeks, where it will not return for weeks more, where the only light comes from the moon, the stars, and the auroras. And yet this darkness is not oppressive. It is quiet and vast and strangely peaceful. The sky is bigger than it ever seems in daylight. The stars are brighter. The world feels older and more patient, as if it is waiting for something that it knows will come. What follows reveals how this waiting shapes the people who live through it. This becomes important later, because the way people respond to the darkness depends not just on the absence of light, but on the presence of other rhythms and other sources of illumination. The polar night is not a void. It is a different kind of landscape, one that reveals itself slowly to those who learn to see it. The people who live in the Arctic during the polar night do not hibernate. They do not shut themselves indoors and wait for the sun to return. They go to work. They go to school. They shop for groceries. They visit friends. They maintain their homes and their communities. Life continues because it has to. But it continues in ways that are shaped by the absence of the sun, by the cold, and by the particular challenges of living in a place where the environment is so extreme that survival depends on preparation and cooperation. In Utqiagvik, the northmost town in the United States, about 4,000 people live year-round. The town sits on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. It is surrounded by flat tundra that stretches out in every direction. There are no trees here. No tall buildings to block the wind. In winter, the temperature regularly drops to 20 or 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind can make it feel even colder. The sea ice extends out from the shore for miles, a frozen plain that merges with the horizon. The town itself is a collection of low buildings. They are brightly painted to stand out against the white landscape. They are connected by roads that are plowed regularly, but still often drifted over with snow. Daily life in Utqiagvik during the polar night follows the clock, not the sun. People wake up in the dark. They go to work in the dark. They come home in the dark. The school day starts and ends in darkness. The grocery store is open during its regular hours, regardless of what the sky looks like outside. Inside, the buildings are warm and brightly lit. Artificial light becomes the primary source of illumination. People learn to structure their days around indoor activities and routines. The lack of sunlight affects the body's internal clock, the circadian rhythm that regulates sleep and wakefulness. Without the natural cues of sunrise and sunset, it can be harder to fall asleep at night or wake up in the morning. Some people use light therapy lamps. These lamps mimic the spectrum of sunlight. They can help regulate mood and energy levels. Others rely on strict schedules and routines to keep their bodies on track. The cold is a constant presence. Stepping outside means bundling up in layers of insulated clothing. Heavy boots, thick gloves, a parka with a fur-lined hood. The air is so cold that it stings the inside of your nose when you breathe. Your breath comes out in clouds of vapor that freeze almost instantly. If you stay outside too long without proper clothing, frostbite can set in within minutes. The wind is the most dangerous factor. On a calm day, even very cold temperatures are manageable. But when the wind picks up, it strips away the body's heat rapidly. The effective temperature, the wind chill, can drop to 50 or 60 degrees below 0. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in less than 5 minutes. Going outside becomes a calculated risk. Something you do quickly and carefully, always with a plan to get back inside. And yet, people do go outside. They have to. Life cannot be lived entirely indoors. Children play in the snow during recess. They are bundled up so thoroughly that only their eyes are visible. Adults walk to the store, to the post office, to visit a neighbor. Some people hunt or fish. They travel out onto the sea ice or inland across the tundra to find food. The indigenous Inupiat people, who have lived in this region for thousands of years, have a deep knowledge of how to move safely through the winter landscape. They know how to read the ice, how to find game, how to build shelters, how to stay warm. This knowledge has been passed down through generations. It continues to be essential for survival in the Arctic. The darkness changes the way people perceive time and space. Without the sun to mark the passage of hours, the days can feel both longer and shorter. Longer because the darkness seems endless, stretching out in all directions. Shorter because without the natural rhythm of day and night, time can slip by unnoticed. Some people find the darkness calming, a time for introspection and rest. Others find it difficult, a weight on the mind that makes it hard to stay motivated or optimistic. Seasonal affective disorder, a type of depression linked to reduced sunlight, is more common in the Arctic than in most other places. The lack of light affects serotonin levels in the brain. This can lead to low mood, fatigue, and difficulty concentrating. But the people who live here have learned to cope. They support each other. They gather for community events. They stay active. They remind themselves that the sun will return, because it always does. Another quiet truth lies beneath this endurance. Something older and deeper. We'll return to that soon. Because the way people cope with the darkness is closely tied to the way they understand their place in the Arctic. It is tied to the traditions and knowledge that have sustained human life here for millennia. There's something deeper to explore about how indigenous cultures have not just survived the polar night, but found meaning and beauty in it. Long before modern towns like Utqiagvik existed, long before electric lights and heated buildings and imported food, people lived in the Arctic through the polar night. They used knowledge that had been refined over thousands of years. The Inupiat people, the indigenous inhabitants of Alaska's North Slope, have occupied this region for at least 4,000 years. Their ancestors before them may have lived here even longer. They did not simply endure the polar night. They understood it. They knew its rhythms and its dangers. They knew when the ice was safe to travel on and when it was not. They knew where to find animals in the winter. They knew how to hunt them in the darkness. They knew how to build shelters that could withstand the wind and the cold. And they knew how to live as a community. They shared food and resources and knowledge so that everyone could survive. Traditional Inupiat winter homes were semi-subterranean structures. They were partially dug into the ground for insulation. The walls were made from driftwood or whale bones. They were covered with sod and turf. Inside, seal oil lamps provided light and heat. These lamps burned whale or seal blubber. They produced a steady, warm flame. The flame could light a room and keep the interior temperature above freezing, even when the outside air was far below zero. The smoke and steam from cooking and breathing would rise. They would escape through a small vent in the roof. The heavy cold air stayed low. This created a stratified atmosphere where the warmest air was at head level when sitting. This design was incredibly efficient. It used minimal fuel to create a livable environment in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Food in winter came primarily from hunting. Seals, whales, caribou, and fish were the staples of the Inupiat diet. All of them required knowledge and skill to catch. Seal hunting on the ice was done in darkness, using sound and patience. Hunters would wait by breathing holes in the ice. They would listen for the sound of a seal surfacing to breathe. They would stand motionless for hours, harpoon ready, until the moment came to strike. Caribou hunting required traveling inland, tracking herds across the tundra. Fishing was done through holes cut in the ice, using lines and hooks made from bone and sinew. Every part of the animal was used. Meat was eaten fresh or stored frozen. Blubber was rendered into oil. Skins were turned into clothing and blankets. Bones were carved into tools. Nothing was wasted because waste was a threat to survival. The Inupiat also had a deep understanding of the natural cycles of the Arctic. They knew that the polar night was not a time of death, but a time of rest and preparation. The animals were still there, still active, but their behaviors changed with the seasons. Seals gave birth on the ice in spring, but they were present all winter, hunting fish beneath the frozen ocean. Caribou moved in predictable patterns. They followed routes that had been used for generations. Whales migrated along the coast in spring and fall. Their arrival was anticipated and celebrated. The Inupiat calendar was not divided into months named for Roman gods or emperors. It was divided into periods named for the things that happened during them. There was a time for whaling, a time for caribou hunting, a time for fishing, a time for preparing and storing food, and a time for the long darkness, when the community gathered together and stories were told. Stories were central to Inupiat culture, especially during the polar night. With little else to do in the long evenings, people would gather and share knowledge through narrative. These stories were not just entertainment. They were a way of passing down information about the land, about survival, about values and ethics. Some stories explained natural phenomena, like the auroras or the behavior of animals. Others taught lessons about cooperation, humility, and respect for the environment. The elders were the keepers of these stories. Listening to them was how younger generations learned the skills and knowledge they would need to survive. The polar night was a time for teaching and learning, a time when the community could focus inward, a time to strengthen the bonds that held it together. This way of life has not disappeared entirely. The modern Arctic looks very different from the Arctic of 100 or 1,000 years ago. But many Inupiat people still hunt and fish. They blend traditional methods with modern technology. Snowmobiles have replaced dog sleds in many cases. But the knowledge of where to go and how to hunt remains the same. Rifles have replaced harpoons for some types of hunting. But the patience and skill required are unchanged. And the stories are still told, passed down from elders to children, preserving a connection to the past that is vital to cultural identity. The polar night is still a time for community, for gathering, for reflection. It is still understood not as an enemy to be fought, but as a season to be lived through with care and respect. The indigenous perspective on the polar night offers a different way of thinking about darkness. In many cultures, darkness is associated with fear, danger, and the unknown. But for the Inupiat, darkness is simply part of the cycle of the year. It is expected. It is normal. And it is accompanied by its own kind of beauty. The auroras are most visible during the polar night, when the sky is dark enough to see their full brilliance. The stars are brighter. The moon, when it is full, can light the landscape so clearly that you can see for miles. The ice and snow reflect even the faintest light. They make the world glow softly, even in the deepest darkness. The polar night is not an absence. It is a presence of a different kind of world. But the people are not alone in this darkness. Something else moves through the winter night. Humans are not the only ones who live through the polar night. The Arctic is home to a remarkable array of animals. Many of them are active all winter long. They navigate the darkness and the cold with adaptations that allow them to thrive in conditions that would kill most other creatures. These animals do not flee south when the sun disappears. They stay, because the Arctic winter, harsh as it is, provides resources and opportunities that are worth the hardships. The polar bear is the most iconic Arctic animal. It is supremely well adapted to life in the winter darkness. Polar bears do not hibernate. The females dig dens in the snow. They give birth to cubs during the winter. They stay in the den for several months while the cubs grow strong enough to venture outside. But the males and non-breeding females remain active all winter. They hunt seals on the sea ice. Polar bears hunt by waiting at seal breathing holes, or by stalking seals that are resting on the ice. They rely on their incredible sense of smell. It can detect a seal from more than a mile away. In the darkness, this sense becomes even more important. A polar bear can navigate the ice by smell and sound, finding prey even when it cannot see. Their white fur provides camouflage against the snow. Their thick layer of blubber insulates them against the cold. A polar bear's body temperature is maintained so efficiently that they can lie on the ice for hours without losing dangerous amounts of heat. Seals are the primary prey of polar bears. They too are active all winter. Ringed seals, the most common seal in the Arctic, live under the ice. They hunt fish and crustaceans in the dark water below. They maintain breathing holes in the ice. They chew through new ice as it forms to keep the holes open. They also create lairs, small caves dug into the snow on top of the ice. These lairs are where they can rest between hunting trips. They provide some protection from the cold and from predators. In late winter and early spring, female ringed seals give birth in these lairs. The pups remain hidden for several weeks while they grow. They develop the blubber they will need to survive in the icy water. Caribou, also called reindeer in other parts of the world, are one of the few large herbivores that remain active in the Arctic winter. Unlike many other deer species, caribou do not migrate south for the winter. Instead, they move across the tundra in large herds. They dig through the snow with their hooves to reach the lichens, mosses, and dried grasses that lie beneath. This process, called cratering, is exhausting work. Caribou must eat constantly to maintain the energy they need to stay warm. Their bodies are covered in thick, hollow fur that traps air. It provides exceptional insulation. Even their noses are covered in fur to prevent frostbite. Caribou are also adapted to see ultraviolet light. It is more abundant in the Arctic twilight than other wavelengths. This allows them to spot lichens, which reflect UV light, even when the landscape appears uniformly white to human eyes. Arctic foxes are small but incredibly tough. They are active all winter. They hunt lemmings and other small rodents beneath the snow. Arctic foxes have extraordinary hearing. They can locate a lemming moving under a foot of snow. Then they pounce breaking through the snow crust to catch their prey. They also scavenge from polar bear kills. They follow the bears across the ice. They feed on the remains of seals. Arctic foxes have the warmest fur of any mammal, a dense double coat that keeps them comfortable even at temperatures far below zero. They also have fur on the bottoms of their paws. It provides both insulation and traction on the ice. Snowy owls are large white birds with piercing yellow eyes. They are another winter resident of the Arctic. Unlike most owls, snowy owls are active during the day, or what passes for day during the polar night. They hunt lemmings. They use their excellent vision and hearing to locate prey in the dim twilight. Snowy owls are one of the few birds that remain in the Arctic year-round. Though some individuals will migrate south if food becomes scarce. Their white plumage provides camouflage against the snow. Their thick feathers insulate them against the cold. They can even survive blizzards by burrowing into snowdrifts and waiting out the storm. Even in the ocean, life continues. Fish swim beneath the ice. Seals and whales hunt them. Tiny plankton drift in the dark water. They feed on nutrients and each other. The entire ecosystem remains active. Slower perhaps than in summer, but unbroken. The animals of the Arctic have evolved over millions of years to live in this environment. The polar night is simply one part of the year they must navigate. They do so with remarkable success. They use senses and strategies that humans can barely imagine. This becomes important later, because the presence of these animals, their resilience and their adaptations, is part of what makes the Arctic feel alive even in the darkest and coldest months. The polar night is not a dead season. It is a time when life takes on different forms, when survival depends on patience and resourcefulness, when the rhythms of the natural world continue even when the sun has vanished. Yet something else shapes this landscape, something colder and more absolute. The darkness of the polar night is profound, but it is not the only challenge of the Arctic winter. The cold is constant and severe. It shapes every aspect of life in the region. Temperatures in the high Arctic regularly drop to 20, 30, or even 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit during the winter months. The coldest temperatures occur not during the polar night itself, but in the weeks just after the sun returns. This is when the ice and snow have had months to radiate away their stored heat. The air becomes as cold as it will get all year. But even during the polar night, the cold is relentless. Cold at this level is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. It is not just uncomfortable. It is dangerous. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal becomes so cold that touching it with bare skin can cause instant frostbite. The metal conducts heat away from the body faster than the body can replace it. Water vapor in the breath freezes into tiny ice crystals that hang in the air. This creates a phenomenon called diamond dust. The air sparkles faintly in even the dimmest light. Liquids freeze solid. Car engines will not start without block heaters to keep the oil from turning into sludge. Batteries lose their charge. Plastic becomes brittle and can shatter. Even the snow changes in extreme cold. It becomes fine and powdery. It squeaks underfoot because the snow crystals are too cold to melt slightly and stick together the way they do in warmer temperatures. The sea ice is one of the defining features of the Arctic winter. As the temperature drops in autumn, the surface of the Arctic Ocean begins to freeze. Small ice crystals form first. They create a slushy layer on the water. As the cold deepens, these crystals bond together into a solid sheet. The ice grows thicker day by day. Eventually, it reaches several feet in thickness by midwinter. This ice is not smooth. It is broken and jumbled by wind and current. It piles up into ridges and pressure cracks. Some areas of ice are flat and solid, safe to walk on. Other areas are thin and unstable. They are covered by a layer of snow that hides the danger beneath. People who travel on the ice must know how to read it, how to tell strong ice from weak ice, how to avoid the cracks and the open water leads that can appear suddenly when the ice shifts. The ice also acts as a platform for life. Seals rest on it. Polar bears hunt on it. People travel across it, using snowmobiles or dog sleds to reach hunting and fishing grounds that would be inaccessible by any other means. But the ice is never completely stable. It moves with the ocean currents and the wind. It cracks and shifts. In some winters, the ice extends far out from shore. It creates a vast frozen plain that stretches to the horizon. In other winters, the ice is thinner and more broken. There are large areas of open water, even in the middle of winter. The ice is a dynamic and unpredictable environment. Those who depend on it must respect its power. Storms are another feature of the Arctic winter. They can be terrifying. Arctic blizzards are not like blizzards in lower latitudes. The snow itself may not be falling heavily, but the wind picks up the loose snow from the ground. It drives it horizontally with such force that visibility drops to zero within seconds. These are called ground blizzards. They can occur even when the sky is clear. The wind in the Arctic can be ferocious. It gusts to 50 or 60 miles per hour or more. Combined with the cold, this creates wind chills that are lethal. During a blizzard, it is impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. The snow fills the air. It stings any exposed skin. It forces its way into every crack and opening in clothing. Sound is muffled. Direction becomes impossible to determine. People caught outside in a blizzard can become disoriented within minutes, even if they are only a short distance from shelter. Every year, there are stories of people who stepped outside during a blizzard and became lost just yards from their homes, unable to find their way back. Because of this, communities in the Arctic take storms very seriously. When a blizzard is forecast, people stay indoors. Schools close. Travel is cancelled. Supplies are stockpiled. And once the storm begins, there is nothing to do but wait it out. Some storms last for hours. Others last for days. During the storm, the wind howls. The building shakes. Snow drifts pile up against walls and across roads. Sometimes they reach the roofs of houses. And when the storm finally passes, the world is transformed. The snow has been sculpted into hard, wind-carved drifts. The roads are buried. The horizon is bright and clean and still. And the work of digging out begins. The cold and the storms and the ice are all part of what makes the polar night what it is. They are not separate challenges. They are intertwined. Each one amplifies the others. The cold makes the ice thicker and the snow drier. The ice makes travel possible, but dangerous. The storms make the cold more dangerous and the darkness more disorienting. Together, they create an environment that is hostile to life in almost every way. And yet life persists. People persist. Animals persist. The Arctic winter is harsh, but it is not insurmountable. It simply demands respect, preparation, and patience. Yet there are also moments of beauty in the midst of all this harshness. Moments when the sky itself seems to come alive with light. We'll return to that soon. Because there are also moments of beauty in the midst of all this harshness. Moments when the sky itself seems to come alive with light. There's something deeper to explore about the auroras and the stars. About the way they transform the darkness into something wondrous. On some nights during the polar night, the sky above the Arctic ignites with color. Curtains of green light ripple and wave overhead. They shift and dance in patterns that seem almost alive. Sometimes the green is joined by red or purple or blue. Layers of color stacked vertically like a luminous painting stretching across the heavens. This is the aurora borealis, the northern lights. One of the most spectacular natural phenomena on Earth. It is most visible during the long darkness of the Arctic winter. The auroras are caused by the interaction between the solar wind and the Earth's magnetic field. The sun is constantly emitting a stream of charged particles, mostly electrons and protons. These particles flow outward through the solar system. When they reach Earth, they are captured by the planet's magnetic field. They are channeled toward the north and south magnetic poles. As the particles descend into the upper atmosphere, they collide with oxygen and nitrogen molecules. They transfer energy to them. When these molecules release that energy, they emit light. Oxygen produces green and red light. Nitrogen produces blue and purple. The result is the aurora, a luminous display that occurs in a ring around each magnetic pole. This is called the auroral oval. During the polar night, when the sky is dark for so many hours each day, the auroras are visible more often and more clearly than at any other time of year. On a good night, the aurora can fill the entire sky. It arcs from horizon to horizon. It pulses and shifts in waves that move almost too fast to follow. The light is bright enough to cast shadows on the snow. Colors shift and blend. Green fades into pink. Purple bleeds into blue. The aurora is silent, or at least it produces no sound that humans can hear. Though there are stories from indigenous cultures of the aurora making a faint crackling or whooshing noise. Some scientists believe this phenomenon may be related to localized electrical discharges in the air. Watching the aurora is a humbling experience. It is a reminder that the Earth is not isolated in space. It is constantly being bombarded by particles from the sun. The magnetic field is a real and active shield protecting life on the surface. The atmosphere is not a static blanket. It is a dynamic and reactive layer where chemistry and physics play out on a grand scale. The auroras are beautiful, but they are also a window into processes that are fundamental to the existence of life on this planet. Without the magnetic field to deflect the solar wind, the Earth's atmosphere would be stripped away over time. Just as Mars lost most of its atmosphere billions of years ago. The auroras are a sign that the shield is working, that the planet is alive and active in ways that are usually invisible. But the auroras are not the only source of light in the polar night sky. The stars are also more visible than they are in most other places on Earth. With no light pollution from cities and no sunlight to wash out the sky, the stars shine with a clarity and brightness that is breathtaking. The Milky Way is not a faint band. It is a river of light arcing across the sky, so dense with stars that it almost looks solid. Constellations that are faint and hard to see from lower latitudes are bright and obvious here. Planets shine like brilliant jewels. Meteors streak across the sky regularly. Tiny bits of space, debris burning up in the atmosphere. And on rare occasions, a comet may be visible, its tail streaming out behind it as it swings around the sun. The winter sky in the Arctic is also home to the moon. The moon plays a more important role here than in most places. During the polar night, the moon can be above the horizon for days at a time. It circles the sky just as the sun does in summer. A full moon provides an astonishing amount of light. Enough to read by. Enough to travel by. The snow reflects the moonlight, amplifying it. The entire landscape glows with a soft, silvery luminescence. Shadows are crisp and dark. The horizon is visible for miles. The world is not bright in the way that daylight makes it bright. But it is not dark either. It is something in between. A twilight world lit by reflected moonlight. Quiet and still and beautiful. The stars and the moon and the auroras transform the polar night from a time of darkness into a time of a different kind of light. The sky is not empty. It is full. And for those who take the time to look up, the polar night offers views of the universe that are simply not possible anywhere else. The darkness is not an absence. It is a canvas. The light of the stars and the auroras and the moon are the brushstrokes that paint it. This is one of the gifts of the polar night. One of the reasons that people who live through it often describe it not as something to be endured, but as something to be experienced. Something that has its own beauty and its own rewards. Yet beneath this beauty, a different kind of challenge waits. Living through months of darkness is not just a physical challenge. It is a psychological one as well. The absence of sunlight affects the human mind in ways that are subtle but profound. The body's internal clock, the circadian rhythm, is regulated in large part by exposure to light, particularly sunlight. Light triggers the production of hormones like serotonin, which regulates mood, and melatonin, which regulates sleep. Without regular exposure to sunlight, these rhythms can become disrupted. The result can be difficulty sleeping, low energy, difficulty concentrating, and in some cases, depression. Seasonal affective disorder is often abbreviated as SAD. It is a type of depression that occurs in a seasonal pattern, usually during the winter months when daylight is limited. It is more common in high latitudes than in places closer to the equator. The Arctic has some of the highest rates of seasonal affective disorder in the world. The symptoms include persistent low mood, loss of interest in activities, changes in appetite, weight gain, fatigue, and a desire to sleep more than usual. For some people, these symptoms are mild and manageable. For others, they can be severe enough to interfere with daily life. But not everyone who lives through the polar night experiences seasonal affective disorder. Many people find that they adapt to the darkness over time. Some use light therapy. They sit in front of bright lamps that mimic the spectrum of sunlight for a certain amount of time each day. This can help to reset the circadian rhythm. It can improve mood. Others maintain strict routines. They go to bed and wake up at the same time each day regardless of whether it is light or dark outside. Exercise also helps. Physical activity increases serotonin levels naturally. And social connection is important. Spending time with friends and family. Participating in community activities. Simply talking with others can provide emotional support and a sense of purpose. The people who have lived in the Arctic for generations have their own ways of coping with the psychological challenges of the polar night. Indigenous cultures place a high value on community and cooperation. The winter months are traditionally a time for gathering, for storytelling, for strengthening social bonds. In the past, when survival depended on the group rather than the individual, these gatherings were essential. They still are, in many ways. Modern Arctic communities continue to hold events and celebrations throughout the winter. Opportunities for people to come together, to remind themselves that they are not alone in the darkness. There is also a kind of beauty and peace that some people find in the polar night. A sense of stillness and quiet that is difficult to find in the noise and busyness of modern life. The darkness slows things down. It encourages introspection. It creates space for rest and reflection. Some people describe the polar night as a time when they feel more connected to themselves, more aware of their thoughts and feelings, more present in the moment. The lack of external stimulation forces a kind of inward turning. For those who are comfortable with that, the polar night can be a time of renewal rather than a time of hardship. But the psychological effects of the polar night are real. They should not be minimized. The absence of sunlight is a challenge for the human brain. The brain evolved in environments where day and night followed each other in regular cycles. Living in a place where those cycles are broken for months at a time requires adaptation. Not everyone finds that adaptation easy. The key for many people is to recognize the challenge, to take active steps to manage it, to use light therapy if needed, to maintain routines, to stay connected with others, to remember that the darkness is temporary, that the sun will return, that the human capacity for resilience is stronger than it often seems. This becomes important later, because the return of the sun is not just a physical event, but a psychological one as well. The first sunrise after months of darkness is a moment of profound relief and joy, a reminder that the cycle continues, that the world is still turning, that light and warmth will return. We'll return to that soon. Another quiet truth shapes this experience. Something older than technology. The polar night shapes not just the physical environment of the Arctic, but the culture and the rhythm of life for the people who live there. In a place where the weather can kill you if you are unprepared, where food must be hunted or imported from thousands of miles away, where the darkness lasts for months and the cold is relentless, survival depends on more than just individual effort. It depends on community, on shared knowledge, on a culture that values cooperation and preparedness above all else. In traditional Inupiat culture, the winter months were a time for indoor activities, a time for maintaining the social fabric of the community. Food that had been gathered and stored during the summer and fall was carefully rationed to last through the winter. Hunting continued, but it was more difficult and more dangerous in the darkness and the cold. So the community relied heavily on preserved foods. Seal oil, dried fish, and fermented meats were staples. Fresh meat from winter hunts was a welcome addition. But it could not always be counted on. The people who managed their resources carefully and shared with those in need were respected and honored. Those who hoarded or wasted were frowned upon, because waste endangered everyone. Modern life in the Arctic is different in many ways. Food can be flown in from Anchorage or Fairbanks. Homes are heated with oil or natural gas rather than seal blubber. But the basic principle remains the same. The Arctic is a harsh environment. Survival depends on preparation and community. People stock up on supplies before winter. They make sure their heating systems are working. They check on their neighbors, especially the elderly and the isolated. They help each other dig out after storms. They share information about ice conditions and weather forecasts. The sense of community is strong, because it has to be. The pacing of life during the polar night is slower than it is in summer. There is less to do outdoors. The darkness makes everything take longer. Simple tasks like going to the store become more complicated when you have to bundle up in heavy clothing and navigate icy roads in the dark. Travel between communities, already difficult in the Arctic, becomes even more challenging in winter. Small planes are the primary means of transportation in rural Alaska. They are grounded by storms, grounded by the lack of daylight. The roads that exist are often impassable, buried under snow or made treacherous by ice. People stay closer to home. They focus on indoor activities. They spend more time with family. They read. They cook. They work on projects that don't require daylight. There is also a strong tradition of storytelling and cultural transmission during the winter months. In the past, this was done orally. Elders would share stories around a fire or a seal oil lamp. Today, it happens in schools, in community centers, in homes, through both oral tradition and written records. The stories are about the land, about the animals, about the ancestors, about the values that have sustained the Inupiat people for millennia. They are stories about respect for nature, about the importance of sharing, about humility and courage. They are also practical. They contain information about how to survive, how to hunt, how to read the weather, how to navigate. The polar night is a time when these stories are told and retold. They ensure that the knowledge and the culture are passed down to the next generation. Modern technology has changed the experience of the polar night in significant ways. Electric lights mean that people are no longer dependent on seal oil lamps or candles. The internet means that people can stay connected with the outside world. They can work remotely. They can entertain themselves with movies and music and games. Satellite television brings news and entertainment from around the globe. Snowmobiles make travel faster and easier than dog sleds ever did. Heated buildings mean that people can be comfortable indoors, even when the outside temperature is far below zero. In many ways, technology has made the polar night less isolating and less dangerous than it once was. But technology has not eliminated the challenges of the polar night. It has simply changed them. The darkness is still there. The cold is still there. The isolation is still there, even with the internet. And the psychological effects of living without sunlight for months are still real. Technology can help people cope, but it cannot replace the sun. It cannot replicate the natural rhythms of day and night that the human body evolved to follow. And so the people who live in the Arctic must still adapt, must still find ways to thrive in an environment that is fundamentally different from the one most humans are built for. The culture of the Arctic is a culture of resilience. It is a culture that has learned, over thousands of years, how to live in a place that seems inhospitable to life. And the polar night is the ultimate test of that resilience. It is a time when the environment is at its harshest, when survival requires not just physical toughness, but mental toughness, not just individual strength, but collective support. And yet, the people of the Arctic have thrived. They have built communities. They have raised families. They have created art and music and stories. They have found meaning and beauty in a landscape that many outsiders see as barren and empty. The polar night has shaped them, but it has not broken them. And every year, when the sun returns, they are still there, waiting to greet it. Something quiet is beginning to shift now. Something that has been waiting all along. The winter solstice occurs around December 21st or 22nd. It marks the moment when the sun reaches its lowest point below the horizon. In the high Arctic, this is the middle of the polar night, the deepest part of the darkness. But it is also a turning point. After the solstice, the sun begins its slow journey back toward the horizon. The change is imperceptible at first. The darkness seems just as complete. The days do not feel any brighter. But if you measure carefully, if you watch the southern sky at midday, you can see that the twilight is lasting a little longer, that the faint glow on the horizon is a little brighter. The sun is climbing back. In the weeks after the solstice, the twilight grows stronger day by day. By early January, the midday sky in places like Utqiagvik is noticeably brighter. The civil twilight that had shrunk to just an hour or two at its shortest point begins to lengthen again. By mid-January, there are several hours of twilight each day. The horizon is clearly visible. Colors begin to return to the landscape. The snow, which had looked uniformly gray in the deep darkness, now shows shades of blue and pink and gold. The ice reflects the growing light. It sparkles faintly under the twilight sky. The world begins to wake up. And then, in the third week of January, usually around the 20th or 21st, the moment arrives. For the first time in more than 2 months, the upper edge of the sun appears above the southern horizon. It is just a sliver, a thin crescent of brilliant light that peeks over the edge of the world for a few minutes before sinking back down. But it is enough. It is the first sunrise after the polar night. It is a moment of profound significance for the people who have been waiting for it. In Utqiagvik, the first sunrise is often marked with a celebration. People gather outside. They bundle up against the cold. They watch the sun return. Some take photographs. Some simply stand and watch in silence. Children who were born during the polar night see the sun for the first time in their lives. There is a sense of relief, of accomplishment, of renewal. The darkness is not over yet. The sun will only be visible for a few minutes today. It will be weeks before it stays above the horizon for more than an hour. But the turning point has been reached. The light is coming back. The polar night is ending. The return of the sun does not happen all at once. It is a gradual process that takes weeks. Each day, the sun stays above the horizon a little longer. The twilight extends further on either side of the brief sunrise. By early February, the sun is above the horizon for more than an hour. By late February, it is visible for several hours. By March, the days are longer than the nights. The Arctic begins to feel less like a place of darkness and more like a place of light again. The snow starts to soften in the sunlight. The temperature, while still cold, begins to rise. The birds that left in autumn begin to return. The first signs of spring appear, even though the landscape is still buried under snow and ice. The psychological impact of the returning sun is immediate and powerful. People report feeling more energetic, more optimistic, more motivated. The light lifts the weight that the darkness had placed on the mind. Sleep becomes easier. Appetite normalizes. The world feels larger and more open. There is a sense of possibility again. A sense that things are moving forward rather than simply holding still. The sun, which is so often taken for granted in lower latitudes, is not taken for granted here. It is a gift, a promise, a reminder that the cycles of the earth continue. That winter always gives way to spring. That light always returns. There is also a poignancy to the first sunrise, a recognition of what has been endured. The polar night is not easy. It tests the limits of human resilience. It asks people to live in ways that are unnatural, to adapt to an environment that the human body and mind are not fully equipped for. And yet people do it. They endure the darkness, the cold, the isolation. They support each other. They find beauty and meaning in the midst of the harshness. And when the sun finally returns, there is a sense of accomplishment, a sense that they have made it through, that they are still here, still alive, still part of this remarkable and unforgiving landscape. The first sunrise after the polar night is more than just a physical event. It is a symbol. It is a reminder that no matter how long the darkness lasts, the light will always return. It is a reminder that patience and perseverance are rewarded. It is a reminder that the cycles of the natural world are larger and more powerful than any individual human experience. By aligning ourselves with those cycles, by accepting them and living through them, we can find a kind of strength and a kind of peace that is difficult to find anywhere else. There is something larger here. The polar night is not an anomaly or an accident. It is a fundamental feature of life at the top of the world, a consequence of the tilt of the Earth and the mechanics of the solar system. It happens every year with absolute predictability. It will continue to happen as long as the Earth continues to spin on its tilted axis. For the people who live in the Arctic, the polar night is simply a season, like spring or summer or fall. It has its own characteristics, its own challenges, its own beauty. It is not something to be feared or avoided. It is something to be lived through, understood, respected. The polar night teaches patience. In a world that is increasingly fast-paced and impatient, where we expect instant results and constant stimulation, the polar night forces a slower rhythm. You cannot rush the return of the sun. You cannot make the darkness end any faster than it naturally will. You can only wait. And while you wait, you must find ways to live, to stay warm, to stay sane, to stay connected to the people around you. The polar night teaches that some things cannot be hurried, that some processes must simply unfold in their own time. that there is value in learning to be present in the moment, rather than always looking ahead to what comes next. The polar night also teaches resilience. It asks people to adapt to conditions that are harsh and unforgiving. It asks them to cope with darkness, with cold, with isolation, with the psychological challenges of living without sunlight. And for the most part, people do cope. They find strategies. They develop routines. They support each other. They draw on traditions and knowledge that have been passed down through generations. The polar night reveals the human capacity for adaptation, for endurance, for finding meaning and purpose, even in the most difficult circumstances. And the polar night teaches humility. It is a reminder that humans are not in control of the natural world, that we live on a planet that follows its own rules, its own cycles, its own rhythms. The sun will set whether we want it to or not. The darkness will come whether we are ready for it or not. The cold will descend whether we are prepared for it or not. The polar night strips away the illusion of control and replaces it with the reality of dependence. Dependence on preparation, on community, on the accumulated knowledge of those who came before. Dependence on the natural cycles of the earth itself. But perhaps most importantly, the polar night teaches appreciation. When you have lived through months of darkness, you do not take the sun for granted. When you have endured the cold and the isolation of the Arctic winter, you do not take warmth and light and human connection for granted. The first sunrise after the polar night is not just another sunrise. It is a miracle, a gift, a promise kept. And every sunrise that follows is a reminder of that moment. A reminder that the light has returned, that the world is still turning, that the cycles continue. The polar night is a window into a part of the world that most people will never see. It is a glimpse of what life is like at the edge of habitability, where the environment is so extreme that survival requires not just technology, but wisdom. Not just strength, but cooperation. Not just endurance, but hope. The people who live through the polar night every year are witnesses to something profound. Something that connects them to the deepest rhythms of the planet and the solar system. They live in a place where the tilt of the earth is not an abstract concept, but a lived reality. Where the mechanics of the cosmos play out in the daily experience of darkness and light. The polar night is also a reminder of the diversity of human experience. Not everyone on Earth lives under the same conditions. Not everyone experiences day and night in the same way. The rhythms of life in the Arctic are fundamentally different from the rhythms of life at the equator or in the temperate zones. And yet, people in all of these places find ways to thrive, to build communities, to create meaning. The polar night is proof that humans are adaptable, that we can make a home almost anywhere, that we can find beauty and purpose even in places that seem hostile to our existence. And finally, the polar night is beautiful. It is not beautiful in the way that a sunny summer day is beautiful, with bright light and vivid colors and warmth. It is beautiful in a different way, a quieter way. It is the beauty of stillness, of silence, of the vast and star-filled sky. It is the beauty of the auroras dancing overhead, of the moonlight reflecting off the snow, of the subtle gradations of twilight that mark the passage of the hours. It is the beauty of endurance, of communities holding together in the face of hardship. It is the beauty of the first sunrise after months of waiting. The light breaking over the horizon like a promise fulfilled. The polar night is a season of darkness, yes, but it is also a season of light, if you know where to look for it. Wishing you calm wherever you are tonight.